Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Robertson. I'm head of the employment team at Mayor Brown. I'm joined by my fellow partners in the employment team, Fisher and Miriam Bruce. And our program is going to focus on life in the time of Corona, the likely short and long-term business issues which employers should be considering now, as well as some of the likely employment challenges that employers are going to have to face. Before we begin, I've been asked to do a short announcement at the start of the webinar about how this all works, which makes me feel a bit like an airline pilot speaking to passengers before a flight. Firstly, at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice there are multiple application widgets that you can use. All of these widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to make the most of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right-hand corner. We're streaming this program through your computer, so there's no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please ensure your speakers or headset are turned on and the volume is up so you can hear us. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection, preferably with Chrome or Firefox browsers, and closing any programs or browsers running in the background that may cause issues. Some networks cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides do become behind, pressing F5 on your keyboard or refresh the page should help. If you have any additional questions about technical problems, answers to common technical problems can be found in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. We hope to have some time at the end of this to answer some questions. To submit a question, you can use the Q&A widget. If for some reason we can't get to your question during the webinar, we'll make every effort to follow up with you afterwards. And likewise, if you want to address any questions to us directly afterwards, again, delighted to come back to you. And obviously, you don't need to wear seatbelts at any point during this webinar. So let's go on to the first slide. So let's start with the beginning with a question. Why start thinking now about a return to work? Given that you're all logged onto a webinar, which assumes we should be doing this, may feel like an odd place to start, but I think it's important. We were discussing less than a week ago what was coming next. And with so many law firms and advisors being focused on the necessary process of advising on furlough schemes, it seemed to us that there was a danger that a much bigger and more important issue was being missed. We are in a short-term transitory phase with a furlough scheme in place. There will be a return to work. The economy requires it in some form. The report from HMRC on day one of the furlough scheme says that something like 10% of the working population is on the furlough scheme or was being claimed for on the furlough scheme on day one. And that's obviously an underrepresentation of true position. So clearly when the furlough scheme ends, there's going to be a major shakeout. And part of the problem, of course, for the government with the furlough scheme is that large-scale redundancies, of course, take a minimum of 45 days consultation. So unless there's an extension by mid-May, redundancy consultation, collective redundancy consultations may be starting then. We'd heard on the grapevine that the reason that the furlough scheme was extended from the end of May to the end of June was that tens of thousands of airline staff were facing redundancies, and redundancy consultation would have been started by now if the furlough scheme hadn't been extended. So first point, of course, is we don't know how much notice people are going to get at the end of the furlough scheme. There may well be pushback if the government gives a long notice period, so they may choose to give a short notice period. In any event, getting employees back to work, whether or not they've been furloughed, is going to take planning and communication and management. Different employees will pose different challenges for employers. Business life is going to be disrupted, and planning for that is going to affect the decisions being taken in respect to the employees. We think that first mover advantage for employers in making an effective and speedy, appropriate return to work is going to put those employers on the forefront of, say, restoring supply chains or customer orders or following up with customers, fulfilling customer orders. Businesses that use the lockdown period, whether or not any part of their operations are working remotely or indeed as normal, businesses that use this period to plan ahead can get themselves into shape and gives themselves the best possible chance of surviving, maybe maximizing their advantages when we go back into a more normal working life. Put like that, you may feel the question is not why should we start planning, but where the hell do we start? Well, the webinar can't possibly pick everything up, but this is our thinking on the issues that we think are likely to confront most employers and what can be done now in the planning phase to use the lockdown time wisely to prepare for what's coming next. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Chris to talk about some of those issues.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm, as Nick said, going to have a look at some of the more immediate issues that we think are likely to arise when employees start being brought back to the workplace, and then I'm going to hand over to Miriam to have a look at some of the more operational issues. So the first and most obvious one perhaps is thinking about how busy are your staff going to be when lockdown comes to an end. Now, we all know that in most businesses the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown has been different as between different employees. We've certainly seen it here at Mayor Brown. Some areas of the business are very, very busy. Some have little or no work, and indeed some staff will have been furloughed. That's not suddenly going to reverse itself when the lockdown finishes, we think, and there will still be pockets of underutilised staff and overworked staff within most organisations. So what can you do? What planning can you do for those people? Well, for the underutilised group, if you want them to stay, then you need to make that clear to them to start with and manage their expectations, because that's the group of staff that are probably going to be most worried that they're coming back with little work to do perhaps in the early days. They may be demotivated if they're not given some assurance, and they may even look to leave to join a competitor firm that perhaps is putting out a clearer or more positive message. What about the overworked group? If you take the example of an accounts department where perhaps in the early stages of the return, the credit control team is going to be busy chasing down unpaid invoices, but the invoicing team perhaps in generating new invoices will be less busy. Again, I think it's all about careful messaging, explaining that for the very busy people, this is hopefully only part of an initial transition, moving back to normal workloads in due course. But it may well be possible in something like an accounts team or people with interchangeable skills in other departments that you can switch staff from one area to another, even if only on a short-term basis. Now, you can't probably just do that unilaterally. It will require discussion with staff, but it's something worth thinking about now before people start being called back to work. Another option I wanted to talk about was staff rotation. Now, this is something that many businesses were already using, we saw before lockdown began, and that was the practice of splitting different groups of people into teams. So you'd have a team A and a team B, and those teams are rotated in and out of the office or a particular work location. Now, that may not be possible for all businesses. If you are a business that really needs all your people working in the office at the same time, that may not work, but for many firms it will be a possibility, because some people can carry on working remotely, and certainly in the last weeks we've all become much more used to doing that. And it does have obvious advantages, and that's why people were doing it before lockdown. First of all, it shows that as an employer you are still thinking about people's health and safety and the risk that is still going to be out there with regard to the pandemic, and you're not just saying to everyone, right, everyone back to work now, it's back to business as usual. It also cuts down, hopefully, the spread of infection risk if you are reducing the need for people to commute by public transport on a very frequent or daily basis. And lastly, and the main reason for the rotation system really is that if you do have a member of one team who becomes ill, then it's less likely that the other team members will become infected, and it does give you better chances of a solid business continuity plan. A variation on rotation of staff is altering people's working hours, which may be part of a rotation plan and is on similar lines. So, for example, where you would be flexing start and finish times for people to avoid those crowded commuter periods where people have to use public transport in particular, or where you have a work location that houses a large number of people, to try to stagger those arrival times and avoid those queuing situations where people are going to be much more closely crowded together, which is not a good idea for obvious reasons. And generally thinking about ways to keep people socially distanced while they are back at work and back in whatever working environment you have. Can you introduce a protocol on how much close contact people will have? How necessary will face-to-face discussions be? Or can you carry on with telephone meetings, WebEx meetings, where close physical contact can be avoided? Now, again, this is something that needs to be thought of now and communicated before people are brought back to work, so that they understand what you're putting in place and why, and they're ready to implement it when they come back into the workplace. And the last point I wanted to mention before I hand over to Miriam was holiday. Now, this has already been a hot topic during lockdown, and the question that was asked was whether employees were able to take holiday if they are working from home during a lockdown period, or indeed if they've been furloughed. There was much debate about whether that was possible. Even could an employer require an employee to take holiday, whether they wanted to or not, during that period, to try to use up that holiday entitlement? Now, the answer at the moment appears to be, unless the government says otherwise, that is possible, and holiday can be taken during lockdown or during furlough, and an employer can even use its powers under the working time regs to require holiday to be taken. Now, that may be unpopular, and if you're not a fan of what can only be described as the most extreme form of staycation, and you don't want to take your holiday whilst you're locked down in your home, then you can see certain employees would not jump at the chance of taking up holiday during the lockdown period. But I think if employers don't think about this and allow employees to return to work with a fully intact holiday entitlement, you could be storing up problems for later, particularly depending when lockdown ends, as we enter it, as we're coming up right into those summer months of July and August. What are you going to do if a large proportion of your workforce start to put in requests to take holiday in July and August? And some employees may start doing this now, thinking this is what's going to happen, lockdown will perhaps end, travel restrictions may be relaxed, I'm going to put in a request for a summer holiday. How are you going to prioritize those requests? What you probably don't want is to simply allow a first come first served basis to apply, with people missing out if they don't get their request in quickly enough. So again, it's thinking about what policy are you going to apply in that situation, what approach are you going to take. Now, it may be helpful, as you probably know, the government has amended the holiday carryover rules to allow holiday that cannot be taken during 2020 to be carried forward for 2 years. But again, it's one thing that the working time regulations have been amended in that way. It's another thing for an employer to actually prevent an employee from taking holiday during the remainder of the holiday year. And obviously there will be a hugely demotivating impact if that is the message that you go out with to your staff as soon as lockdown ends. But again, it's just coming up with what is a fair process, or as fair a process as you can. Are you going to prioritize people who worked throughout the lockdown and who were not furloughed and were fully utilized? How is that going to be received by people who are perhaps already feeling undervalued and worried about their jobs, who may have been furloughed? I think most employers are trying to avoid perpetuating the divisions between furloughed and working staff, and so that type of holiday policy approach may not be an attractive one. But it's certainly, as I say, something to think about, because we do see this as being a big issue as we come into the summer period. And with that, I'm going to finish, and I'll hand over to Miriam.
Thanks, Chris. Let's now turn our attention to some operational issues to consider on resuming work, because we think employers should be turning their mind to these issues now, as Nick mentioned at the start. In our view, we can't assume that the old norms of behaviour when doing business are going to apply in the short term, and that throws up a few particular issues to consider in our view. First of all, client entertainment. Employers are going to have to balance their health and safety obligations towards employees against business development initiatives by exploring alternative non-contact forms of marketing and business development, for example webinars. Secondly, business travel is certainly going to be an issue. If current travel restrictions are lifted and the aviation industry becomes operational again, employers will have to be mindful of important considerations relating to business travel, such as the countries to which employees will be travelling to, who will authorise such travel, what to do if you get objections, and whether employees who were previously diagnosed with coronavirus will take on more travel than those employees who didn't get it. Of course, the latter consideration will depend on any medical evidence establishing that previous sufferers would be immune from future infection, which, as we know, is in some doubt at the moment. The next issue we think needs to be considered is that following the lockdown, employers will have to consider the way client and supplier meetings are held. Even before lockdown, there were concerns around those sorts of meetings, and because face-to-face meetings will only increase the spread of virus, and therefore careful consideration will need to be taken as to the manner in which those meetings will be conducted in future. Certainly in these working from home times, we've seen a real advance in technology and means of communicating and holding meetings virtually. And finally, we think businesses should assess the way that they currently operate and whether that model is sustainable, flexible and necessary. For example, staff reviews, promotions and the work that employees are actually required to do. From an HR perspective, the annual HR cycle may have grown up as a matter of tradition rather than business necessity. For example, is there a genuine business requirement that business need to undertake staff reviews in May, or is it simply that there's always been a staff review in May? Do promotion rounds have to take place at the end of the calendar year, or can the work involved in that be deferred for 6 months without doing undue harm and freeing up appropriate resource to get a business up to speed post-lockdown? The second operational issue that we think should be at the forefront of employers' minds now is making sure premises are made safe. Employers will have to address the health and safety concerns within the working environment, and employees will be very aware and expecting employers to be taking this seriously from the outset. Different working environments will have to be dealt with differently, of course. For example, hot desking, shared offices, open plan workspaces will all present different challenges. Employers may have to consider installing screens around individual workspaces or restricting the number of people who have access to the work premises. As Chris talking about having people access the office in teams, certainly through a transitional phase. And we're hearing stories from other parts of the globe who are more advanced in their escape from lockdown and learning from that too. So in China, for example, many businesses are implementing measures in the workplace to reinforce social distancing, including having meals delivered to employees' desks so as to minimize the use of communal eating spaces. It will be critically important for employers to clearly and regularly communicate with staff that where any employee feels unwell, they should refrain from reporting to work. Employers will also need to make sure that they have sufficient stock of hand sanitizer available on the work premises and reinforce messages about social distancing. Particularly, we saw before the lockdown that many employers were struggling to get hold of the necessary sanitizer resource to service their office. And of course, there's been much talk about face masks and their effectiveness in preventing the further spread of the virus. There may come a time when employers are required to consider the value of encouraging or enforcing face mask wearing in the office, and whether in fact they need to provide such masks to employees as part of their health and safety obligations. Separately, employers will also need to consider hotspots for infection in the workplace, such as communal kitchens, lifts, vending machines, canteens and so on, and to ensure that these areas are sufficiently closed off to avoid any employees from gathering. And it's worth remembering that employers have a duty to report any cases of infection in the workplace, and failing to do so is subject to criminal sanction. A return to work may result in the spread of the virus in the workplace, thereby triggering the employer's duty to report such instances. This is no doubt a significant consideration for employers to take into account when preparing a return for the business after the lockdown. The penultimate issue I wanted to look at is consideration of virus testing and other testing of staff. Where employers consider virus testing for their workforce, they of course have to be mindful of privacy and GDPR challenges that this presents. Equally, there's been some talk in recent weeks of contact tracing apps which could be issued to staff, which would enable an employer to help protect staff from infection at work. Obviously, the privacy and GDPR implications of this would need to be thought through very carefully. And whether or not employers can make use of virus testing in the workplace, ultimately they need to be open and transparent with the workforce about the use or otherwise of such tests. From a privacy perspective, whilst nothing prevents an employer from requesting that an employee consents to taking a test, an employee can't suffer any form of reprisal for refusing to do so. And just touching on GDPR, obviously a global pandemic is likely to result in the need for employers to collect, hold and disclose employees' medical data. And such data is of course considered sensitive personal data and has to be processed in accordance with the requirements of GDPR. Of course, employers can process medical data relating to a data subject where it's necessary for the employer to comply with its legal obligations in relation to health and safety. But further consideration has to be given to the enhanced health and safety duties that employers have towards pregnant women and disabled employees, as well as any other vulnerable categories of staff. And then finally, before I hand over to Nick, who's going to talk about some long-term planning issues, I think it's just worth bearing in mind that there's obviously much talk of a potential second wave of pandemic, and equally in the absence of a vaccine, any relaxation of lockdown could serve to increase the spread of the virus and prompting further lockdowns and disruption to business. And obviously we can use the current experience to learn and better prepare for what comes next. So we think employers could be using the time now to collate the experiences of all those affected across its workforce, from furloughed employees to employees working remotely and those responsible for managing the business, to identify areas where operations were robust and areas that could be improved. And the value of doing this is twofold. By collecting the experiences, the employer will be in a better position to plan for any resurgence of the pandemic, for example, through the acquisition of more technology or providing better support to employees. And of course, importantly, employees will feel valued in being afforded the opportunity to highlight their experiences and express their opinion. Now I'm going to hand over to Nick now, who's going to talk about some of the longer term issues that employers should be considering.
Thank you, Miriam. I was going to talk about longer term issues because we've been focusing on immediate issues that are likely to affect many employers. And I think we also need to raise our glance a bit, raise our gaze a bit, and look longer term as well. It's going to hardly come as a surprise that employers need to be making long-term decisions now affecting employees' future, and that again using this period to plan ahead and to commence implementation of these longer-term changes is as essential as planning now to address the short-term issues, the issues that are likely to come up immediately on a return to work. First up, well, it's the obvious one. Employers need to review headcount realistically. This is obviously a particular issue for employers with furloughed staff, but we think it's going to be essential for almost all employers to conduct a thorough review of headcount. And if there's one thing we've all learned from years of advising clients or working within clients, is that sadly, if headcount reductions are to be made, there's often a great pressure to make those headcount reductions as soon as possible so that savings are thereby generated. Now, there are counterbalancing considerations. For some employers, the prospect of paying out lump sum redundancy pay or payment in lieu of notice or anything like that will be deeply difficult. The furlough scheme as it exists, there may be arguments that dismissing staff while they could still be on the furlough scheme might be unfair. It wouldn't surprise me to see those arguments coming through. There may be employee relations issues. There may be public relations issues about being seen to make redundancies too soon. But each employer will have to decide the extent to which it is going to be affected by those wider considerations. And obviously, a headcount review can only follow after a business review. What do you think is going to happen with customers? What do you think is going to happen with suppliers to the employer? What is going to happen with supply chains to customers, for example? So there's a fair amount of planning before an employer is in a position, in these conditions of maximum uncertainty, to make longer-term decisions about the size of the workforce and where it wants to continue to invest and where it wishes to scale back. Obviously, in the UK, if you're making 20 or more redundancies in a 90-day period from one establishment, a typical collective redundancy process can last easily 6 to 8 weeks. Larger scale redundancies, 100 or more, will take longer. The question is, of course, can the employer use part of the lockdown period to commence those sort of collective consultation, to do the planning, and indeed to commence and possibly implement necessary job reductions rather than trying to manage this starting after a return to work? That in turn will then lead into how will the employer manage remote collective consultation? How will the employer manage remote individual consultation? Things like balloting for voting to choose employee representatives, if there's going to be a committee set up specifically to deal with the collective consultation issues. How will that take place? Well, we know of one example with a company in the UK which has where they were looking at trying to work out how to get approval for pay cuts. And there they've always balloted, paper ballots, secret voting, and the union was saying it would be impossible. They would not be willing to participate or support any sort of balloting process, so there would have to be a workaround. They weren't prepared to take the risk of having ballots and ballot papers, and they were hostile, and the workplace generally was not accustomed to working with remotely, and therefore electronic voting was seen as something not to be trusted. So it was a practical issue, if you like, about in a slightly different context, but a very relevant one. We think there's nothing in the furlough scheme which prevents employers commencing redundancy consultation during the furlough period. It might be argued that consulting with staff is asking them to work while they're on furlough, and that would therefore disqualify that member of staff, which would obviously be self-defeating. But 2 points. First of all, there's no chance that the only redundancies that are going to occur are only going to be amongst furloughed staff. They're clearly going to be, sadly, a wider shakeout in the British economy than that. But even for staff on furlough, we think that there's a world of difference between requiring staff to work and offering staff the opportunity to, say, stand as an employee representative, to represent the interests of employees, or to participate in employee consultation individually about whether or not that person should be made redundant. We don't think that is working for the employer, common sense basis. And if we are right that come mid-May, assuming that the furlough scheme has not been extended, there are going to be large numbers of collective consultations commenced. There would be howls of protest if employers were told you can't start collective consultation without taking employees off furlough. So on that basis, if you have done your planning, then there will be pressure to use the extended lockdown period for staff, whether or not they're on furlough, to do the necessary collective consultation, at least get a long way down the road, so that you're in a position to make any sadly necessary headcount reductions shortly after a return to work, if not at the point of a return to work. We would encourage employers to think creatively about what support they can offer and be seen to offer staff who are sadly losing their jobs. This is going to be a horrible time to lose your job. The chances of finding alternative work is obviously going to be reduced in comparison with the normal state of affairs. So if there's anything that employers can do above and beyond what they normally offer staff, then we think that would be very sensible. Remember, of course, it's important to remember the remainers. We haven't heard that before. But in this case, most cases, for most employers, the majority of staff will stay with them. You hope that it will be a very small number of employers that are getting rid of more than half of their staff. So the remainers will see how their colleagues are treated when they're being let go. And if ever there was a time to be seen to be doing things creatively, with kindness, and not doing it mechanistically, taking all the shortcuts that are open to you, I think this is the time to be seen to be doing it, because the remainers won't forget how they see colleagues being treated on the way out. If hard decisions have to be made, so be it. But how they're communicated and being seen to do them in as supportive a way as possible will, even if you just look at it as a business decision rather than ethical one, it'll pay dividends. Conversely, employers need to think about their hiring needs now. And they should also be thinking about which of their staff are key, but may be vulnerable to being recruited away from them. Think of the behaviour in the downturn 10 years ago. Some employers looked to strengthen areas of operations to build themselves up at a competitive expense, or by doing it through internal promotions if they thought areas needed to be beefed up, or employees switched across to work in areas that were going to be growth areas rather than areas where some retrenchment was taking place. Some employers may indeed see the current disruption in the courts as an ideal time to do some, let's call it, adventurous hiring, or indeed team moves. I was speaking to a QC yesterday evening, and he's in court next week on an emergency injunction. It's all being done remotely, but obviously it's much more disruptive than the normal process. So some employers might think now's the time to take a bit of a flyer with some recruitment. How likely is the employer losing staff to actually react fast enough? So one of the things we were suggesting is, if you are looking, having done your review, you're looking at hiring, can you get the hiring process underway during lockdown so that when the lockdown ends, the notice period for your new recruit is already running? If employers are looking at external hiring, how's your hiring process going to work remotely? If everyone in the company is not locked down, is working from home remotely, does your recruitment process work well enough? Is it going to be scrupulous enough that you will do the same level of scrutiny that you would do if you're having someone in face-to-face for a meeting in person? Thinking about those issues now will enable employers to move much faster if they decide that there's a need to recruit externally. On the defensive side, planning now may be equally advantageous. We would suggest employers do analysis. Who are your key staff? Look at any defensive measures that you can put in place to ensure such staff don't get recruited away. So this is purely management, staying more in touch with such staff, giving them appropriate responsibilities, giving them recognition, etc. But have you got access to their contracts of employment if you need it in a hurry? What about handbooks? Are you ready to react swiftly if one of your key members of staff hands in their notice, so that you can consider whether your response is legal? Your response predominantly going to be a management one, in which case, how are you going to try and remotely? You can't take them out for a beer, for example. But you need to think about these things ahead of time rather than trying to make it up when the crisis has hit. On the subject of policies, I mentioned recruitment policies just a moment ago. It's not just recruitment policies that could usefully be reviewed during this lockdown period. The lockdown period can be used to review many policies and how they will work during any remaining lockdown period, or indeed, if, as maybe we all fear, there's a further lockdown period waiting for us down the road. Employers, for example, are like to have far more staff working from home on a regular basis, ignoring lockdown. How will that work? Just policies off the top of the head. Disciplinary and grievance policies. Do they assume meetings will take place in person? If so, you may need to change your policies. What about your sickness policies? Is the level of sickness pay that you currently provide appropriate in the new world of pandemic? What about reporting obligations for employees reporting in? Is it appropriate to have the same level of reporting obligations when employees are working remotely? You may say so, you may say not. But if you don't review it, you'll just do the same old, same old. Talking about lockdown and home working, the other longer term issue is we think there's clearly going to be pressure from change in the balance of working from home and working in the office. And the pressure may come from two sides. Employers may be keen to push employees into much more home working, reduce expenses for premises, for example, and if employers are looking keenly at all possible savings, that's an obvious one, isn't it? But equally, the pressure may come from employees to be allowed to do more home working. People may have discovered that they enjoy home working and in the circumstances are reluctant to go back to a full-time desk job that requires them to add commute time on top of their daily job. We think that some employers may well have in the past had lines about what jobs could be done remotely and what jobs could not be done remotely. Well, we bet there's going to be pressure on employers to review that. And one of the things we'd be saying is, don't wait for that to come in. Look at this issue now. Take feedback during the lockdown period now to start working out what for your business works and doesn't work. If your view is you still don't want to have prolonged home working either for all staff or in certain categories of staff, get the evidence now about why it doesn't work, or prepare to meet the argument, look, we've just been on a X-week lockdown, it worked fine. So the idea is to, if you don't want to allow that situation to perpetuate, what will you say in response? Equally, if you're then looking at some sort of ongoing permanent working from home arrangements, do your contracts need to be amended to allow or to require working from home? We think in practical terms there's a world of difference between something that says you will be permanently based at home, save for the occasional meeting in the office, from you may work 1 or 2 days at home, or we would like you to work 1 or 2 days a week at home. But you have to do the homework to think your contracts, your policies, to see how all that will work. And before I hand over to Chris to talk about the importance of communications in all of this, the other point I wanted to make is if home working is going to be more regular, then managers are going to need to learn to manage staff remotely. They may not have had guidance or training on that, or if they have, it should be reviewed if they're managing far more staff, or if they're managing staff working remotely for a greater percentage of their time, or if indeed the manager themselves is working remotely. So we would expect employers, where they envisage or accept, willingly or otherwise, that home working is now going to be much more of a feature of their working operations, to review or provide guidance to managers on how to manage. But equally, they should be looking at training perhaps for staff, how to work effectively at home. What are the particular pitfalls that staff working at home need to be aware of? It can't just be the regular raiding of the fridge for the regular snacks that some people have been talking about. There are other issues, of course, as well. So some sort of forward thinking on that will enable employers to come up with appropriate policies, appropriate guidance, appropriate support. But also, and I think this is extremely important, will be seen as fair by staff coming back to work. Because I think one of the things that will be most corrosive in all of this is if staff feel that maybe senior staff are being allowed to work from home and junior staff aren't, or that different people have been treated unfairly. And having a policy and a standardised approach, albeit with some flexibility, is probably going to be extremely helpful for employers looking to manage their way through this. So, having said that, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about the importance of communication in all of this.
Thanks, Nick. So, yes, I'm going to talk about communication being king, and I think you all have noticed that there's a general theme in everything we're talking about really on this webinar. Communication with staff is at the heart of it all, and I think when you think about a return to work in the current circumstances, employers have a duty in any event to consult with their staff about health and safety issues, and a return to the work during a pandemic is clearly a health and safety issue. So it's something that employers are going to need to be speaking to their employees, and it's thinking about the best way to do that. As Nick mentioned, some employers will be looking at quite significant structural changes, possibly even during the lockdown period, but certainly once it comes to an end and perhaps the lifeline of the furlough subsidy is withdrawn. A lot of employers are going to be looking at possible, continuation of permanent pay cuts, headcount reduction, changing in working hours, short-time working, or just other changes to contracts. I've got clients who are looking at, drafting in layoff clauses so that if we reach pandemic 2, they can furlough people more quickly than perhaps they did this time round. Now, a lot of that is likely to be a formal collective exercise, which Nick talked about, where if you are a unionized environment, you will be consulting with a trade union, or if you have some other already elected staff body that covers those sorts of formal exercises, you'll be consulting with them. But I think what we've seen, and certainly I've seen with clients I've spoken to, is the benefits that having an elected standing committee can bring in times like this. And I think often there is a nervousness among certainly private sector clients to collective employee bodies. But I think now is the time when they really can be worth their weight in gold, even if you only have a temporary one for the remainder of this year. There's no reason not to use the time you've got now while people are in lockdown to get those bodies up and running, have your election process, do your balloting, as Nick said. We don't think there's any reason why that should interfere with any furlough rights that employers should have if employees are standing as representatives for those sorts of elected bodies. And they really can be helpful in times like this when unpopular decisions need to be made, and they need to be made quickly. And I've got one client in particular where it's unionized, it's got a very cooperative, very good relationship with its union, and it allowed it to reach agreement on things that it couldn't conceivably have reached agreement on as quickly as it did if it hadn't had that collective way of reaching that agreement. Now, if you are electing your own standing body, you do need to make sure that you get the remit of it right when you are going out to staff to vote for it. If you want it to cover collective redundancies and collective changes to contracts and possibly cheapy transfers if you're moving bits of your business around, you need to make that clear in the balloting process so people know what they are voting for, and they will then not be able to challenge it later on when you come to use that body for those formal structural changes. And I think, though, beyond the benefits that are brought with the formal exercises that those bodies can be used for, I think we'll see employers perhaps using them as a resource more broadly than that, and they'll be inviting perhaps those bodies to contribute to their plans that they're putting into place when people come back to work. The policy changes that Nick talked about, I think it can send a very positive message to staff to say that this body will be used for that purpose, so that staff views on these issues will be taken into account in formulating the plans going forward. One easy way of doing it that a lot of I think clients are looking at doing is some form of staff survey when a return to work happens, about how did the company do with the recent lockdown. What were the good points, what were the bad points, what are the lessons learned, so that if we have to do it again, how can we improve? and obviously an elected staff body would be an ideal forum to canvass views on a survey like that. But the last point I want to make is just that obviously it's no substitute for direct individual communications. Some of these will be company-wide announcements. Some will be more targeted at certain groups. We've talked a lot about the group of furloughed staff who may be feeling more vulnerable than employees who have carried on working and been fully utilised during the lockdown. If the employer wants to retain them, there'll need to be a process to reintegrate them into the workforce, and that will be different, no doubt, to the employees who have been working, albeit remotely, largely as normal. And I think that we've talked already about the dangers of not doing that and the impact on those staff feeling undervalued compared to the other staff who were fully utilised. One easy way, again, I think, to show to that group of staff that the employer is interested in them and it does value them is to ask about their experiences on furlough. So not just during lockdown, but on furlough, and how can the business support them if a further period of furlough might be necessary. And finally, I think above all else, it's important to make clear to all of the workforce that as an employer you are going to continue monitoring the medical position. I remember when Brexit first happened, one of the main criticisms of firms was they didn't go out with a message about what are we doing, what is our plan for Brexit. They were just silent about it, for understandable reasons, because employers didn't really know how it was going to pan out. But all staff often want to know is that the employer is monitoring the situation, it's looking at the government guidance and the medical guidance, and above all else, it's putting the health and safety of the workforce as its paramount concern. I think statements to that effect can be very powerful and reassuring to the workforce where, let's face it, there's going to be anxiety about returning to the workplace when we are still in the midst of a pandemic. And on a happy note, I will hand over back to Miriam and Nick to talk about some of the other challenges that employers might face on a return.
So what sort of additional challenges might employers face on a return to work? Clearly there'll be a multitude of issues, some of which we've already looked about, but we've picked here some other examples of the likeliest topics to come up. And as we've said throughout, employers should be thinking about how they'll handle such issues now to put them at a competitive advantage when normal operations resume. So the first issue to consider is what happens with staff who are concerned about a return to work and the health risks involved. Essentially, where an employee is not themselves sick, then it would be a legitimate instruction to require that employee to report for work. However, these are sensitive and unprecedented times, and employers should carefully consider their approach. We think it highly likely, for example, that some individuals may well try to argue that the employer will be acting in breach of its health and safety obligations by requiring employees to travel in, say using public transport or being required to come into a work location and work in a crowded environment. In the circumstances, an employee's legal rights will be relevant to this issue. Where an employee has an underlying medical condition, an employer will be under a duty to make reasonable adjustments where that employee is disabled. Working from home in this environment or in a newly released from lockdown environment may be considered a reasonable adjustment under the circumstances. The situation might be different for an employee who cannot work from home but who's equally too anxious to report into the office. Here the employer may consider alternative roles after discussion with that individual for a period of time or a period of no pay or reduced pay until the position becomes clearer. In circumstances where an employer is left with no option but to look at disciplinary action for an employee not attending work, then we think it would be very important to distinguish between the employee's right to voice the view that they should not have to attend work and the manifestation of it, i.e. not actually attending work. This should steer an employer around any complexities if the employee tries to claim that they are expressing a philosophical belief, i.e. a belief that there is an obligation on humans to live their lives in a way which is consistent with the lowest possible transmission rate of coronavirus, or similarly expressed belief. The employer will need to be very clear that the employee is entitled to express that belief, but that does not prevent the employee from being required to attend work. What about staff who are shielding? Well, staff who are shielding will continue to do so until medical advice changes. And where the furlough scheme has ended and such staff continue to shield, they'll continue to qualify for statutory sick pay. And some employees will likely treat shielding employees as qualifying for company sick pay for the balance of the shielded period, depending on the actual rules of the scheme. And before I hand over to Nick, just another point to think about, what about if childcare or elder care problems arise, i.e. you can't get arrangements in place in time for return? Clearly employees will have to be understanding and will want to be understanding here, but there may well come a point when the line has to be drawn. Identifying a policy that indicates individuals who have such problems will need to have discussions with their managers, but say will be given extra time, perhaps 5 days, to resolve matters rather than the statutory 2, might be appropriate. Obviously, the employer will be mindful that an employee may simply require a period of parental leave if they have children who qualify under the scheme, in order to ensure that their childcare arrangements continue and can continue until appropriate alternative arrangements are in place. So I'm just going to hand over to Nick now, who's going to talk about a few other additional points to think about.
Yes. So one of the issues that we've seen already, but is clearly going to become much more of an issue if there is a return to work, is what do employers do about informing staff if one of their colleagues has been covered with the virus and has been in attendance at work? So there is a risk of others becoming infected as a result. And it's a real issue. We've had isolated cases of that already when we've advised clients. ICO guidance on the subject says that in general terms it's fine to pass on anonymized information that an individual has become sick, but it wouldn't normally be necessary to provide the individual name. I'm not entirely sure, with the greatest respect to the ICO, I'm necessarily in accordance with that. And I think it may be important to distinguish between a notification generally to, say, an office that someone has gone down with the virus and who've been attending work, but those who are actually directly affected, who maybe worked with that individual, might have a right to know rather more about what's happened, so that they can take appropriate measures and be advised accordingly. We'll see how that goes, but in the meantime, what we are certain is it would be helpful to talk to staff committee, health and safety body, whatever, so that there's a policy in place about what will happen, so that everyone understands it, rather than dealing with it when the point actually arises. The other 2 points, I've just mentioned them briefly, as really points to think about. Chris has touched on the importance of eradicating differences between furloughed and non-furloughed staff in a return to work, and we think that's extremely important. It's possible that there may be resentments on either side of that divide. Furloughed staff feel resentful they are somehow less valued. The staff who've worked through feeling resentful that they've had to work through and furloughed staff haven't. Sooner those differences can be eradicated, the better. The other thing is, of course, which hasn't really been an issue for employers up to now, is about managing different risk profiles of employees. Let's assume, for the sake of the argument, older employees are continue to risk from the virus, and younger, healthy employees are less at risk. Younger, healthy employees resume more of a social life that might bring with it the risk that they get infected. How are you going to manage a situation if older employers start saying, we don't want to work alongside younger employees who are behaving in that way? What's going to be the norm for behaviour, the expectations? Or to put it another way, how loaded is the question now? What are you doing this weekend? How loaded is that question going to become in a work environment? Anyway, So that's what I wanted to be talk about in terms of the challenges that employers, some of the challenges employers might face in a return to work situation. Final slide is just a list of some of the Mayor Brown materials that we've put together, which contain a lot of our sort of collective thinking on the issues, and a checklist that is designed to summarize some of the points that we've made, but also used for planning purposes and some of the practical steps that we've talked about in this webinar. So let's turn to deal with some of the questions that have come in.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's I think we're now into the live section of the webinar. This is Chris Fisher here. Thank you very much for dialing in and for joining the webinar. We've had a few questions that we're going to run through, but first of all, before we get to those, I'm conscious that we've had a couple of comments that I think the sound dropped in a couple of places. I think there was one on my section and one of Nick's. On my section, it was I was talking about communication being king. I think it was the bit where I moved from the importance of collective communication and staff and the help that a staff body can bring to direct individual communication. Really, the point I was just making was that whilst staff bodies can be very helpful, they're no substitute for direct individual communications with individual employees, which will still need to take place. Nick, I think there was also a part on one of your slides.
Yes, thanks. Yes, I was talking about long-term planning and some defensive measures analysis. I was in particular talking about the need for employers to be ready to react swiftly if key staff do leave or threaten to leave, and in particular the need to decide very quickly, is your primary response a legal response or a management response, i.e. does it persuade people to stay rather than threatening them? Because you need to be able to reach that sort of decision, but really, really very quickly. So having got that clarificatory bit out of the way, we've had a few questions in. So Miriam, I think you do the short straw not to answer the first couple of questions, and then Chris will
sure.
I'll pick up the last couple and close up.
Sure, thanks very much. Hi everyone. So the first question we received was, can you furlough someone for a period of garden leave? If they're already under notice, we think the answer here is yes, you can, given that the scheme is designed to help businesses with their costs so that they can survive, rather than just about preserving employment. So we think that's certainly possible. The second question that we received was a clarification question, which was what exactly is shielding. So shielding is where guidance has been issued by the government that certain people who are most likely to become unwell if they're vulnerable or older need to stay at home. So that's what we meant by shielding. Chris, I think you're going to pick up the next questions.
Yeah, sure. We had a couple of questions, which I'm pleased to say. The first one I don't actually know the answer to, but I'm going to try and find out. The question is, and there may be, I'm sure people who are on the webinar who may know better than me, is whether the furlough scheme is going to be extended beyond the the current expiry date of the end of June. Obviously, that's already been extended by 1 month. It was originally due to end at the end of May. I do know Rishi Sunak was, I believe yesterday, was talking about extending it further into July. I don't know whether he went as far as being specific and said it would be another 1 month extension. I will try and find out some more about how concrete the government's been about extending it. I guess it may depend what they decide to do about starting to return people out of lockdown when the current lockdown period comes to an end. So they may be waiting to see what happens then. But I will try and find out more about that. Obviously, that's going to be critical to keep an eye on. The other associated question from someone else was that will the government drop the subsidy level that they're currently providing of 80% of pay to a lower percentage, 60% or 40% perhaps? And what should employers be thinking about if that happens? Again, it's obviously quite possible that they will do that. I think that would cause quite some operational difficulties for employers if they do, where employers have agreed with staff that they will drop, that they will have their salary reduced to the furlough level, and they've agreed a contractual variation to that effect. Obviously, where staff have been furloughed on full pay, it won't matter. It would just mean that as an employer, you will only be able to recover a lower proportion of that full pay. But where you have reached some sort of contractual variation, or indeed you're consulting with staff about reductions, you will need to revisit those if you want to drop down to the revised furlough level, unless you have drafted it with sufficient foresight in your drafting of the variation to say that the amount of pay will reflect the level of furlough subsidy, whatever that may be from time to time, perhaps. Because as we know, written consent will be necessary for making deductions from wages of staff. You cannot just unilaterally reduce an employee's pay without their written consent. So that will need addressing as soon as that becomes clear that that is what's going to happen. That's something that will need immediate attention. Nick, I think you had do you have any comments on that?
A couple of questions. Yeah, I was going to make a couple of comments. We know unless the scheme is extended, companies doing collective large-scale redundancies are going to have to start by mid-May. So it's a pretty racing certainty that the government, if it's going to extend the scheme in any way, is going to do so within the next week or 10 days. And there are reports last time round about airline companies laying off tens of thousands. I saw a report yesterday or today, BA talking about laying off 12,000 people. So there's clearly, Chris, you're absolutely right in terms of it's going to be tied into the return to work somehow. They're going to have to decide on it relatively quickly. The other thing is, I think there's a comment in the FT today suggesting they might be looking at something that said furlough scheme will carry on, may carry on, but there would be restrictions on things like dividends being paid to shareholders and companies claiming making use of furloughs. And on the basis that I think there are 4 million people currently furloughed, that's a colossal percentage of the UK's total working population. The government is going to be terrified that even if only half of them get made redundant when we go back to work, they're going to try and stagger that or soften that particular landing. In terms of question I picked up to answer, it was about the selection process when you're on furloughing. And are people going to be using selection criteria? How are we going to do this? Now, my instinct on that is you don't want this to look like a redundancy selection scheme in reverse. I think employers generally want to move away from suggesting that if you're furloughed, you're at risk of redundancy. And if you apply redundancy type processes to furlough in or out, that's going to rather reinforce the perception that you are somehow it's a glorified redundancy exercise by another name. That said, I do think having some sort of fair process is going to be key, and some sort of advanced explanation staff about how people are going to be unfurloughed so that people can see what's being done is fair and reasonable is essential. On the same point, however, I think any process has got to be operating with a degree of common sense. Because if you think about it, this is really tied up with is there going to be a compulsory return to work or not? Are you compulsorily bringing people back into work in offices, premises, buildings, premises owned by the employer? Are you compulsorily returning people to work off furlough? Or is this still in the initial stages at least trying to work with people, those who want to come in, those who want to come back to work, as opposed to requiring? And my suspicion, and it's probably any higher than that, is that people will get acclimatized to going back to work, and therefore what might originally be something that is sort of, unpopular, and there are hostile reactions to it on day one, after a week or two, people may be more willing to go back to work. So I think it's going to be a gradual process, where possible, working with staff rather than instructing them in the face of detailed opposition. The other point, and it's a very quick one, someone's asked, how do we get hold of the checklist we referenced? What we'll do is we'll send out a link to that checklist to everyone on this webinar, so that everyone's got access to it as a sort of useful planning document. So I think that's it for this webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We hope you found it was useful. Very, very heartfelt plea. If you have any questions, please do let us know. We're always happy to come back to people directly. Similarly, if you've got thoughts, if you're seeing different things, if your companies and organisations are doing different things, or are trying some of the things that we've talked about, share the experience. I mean, to an extent, we're all in this together. So please do feel free to share thoughts and experiences, because then we will understand better what's going on out there in a whole range of organisations. So please do take that as an open invitation to get in touch with us. Just to say again, thank you very much, and in keeping with my airline pilot's announcement at the start of this webinar, we hope that you fly again with us sometime soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.